Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Unit 7, Lecture 1. So for this unit, we're really looking at the way nonprofit organizations interact. In this first week, we're looking at the interactions with government, and then we're going to segue into relationships with private organizations in the second half of this unit. So you might notice that this is set up a little bit differently. There is no accompanying PowerPoint. Instead, I wanted to give people an opportunity who had provided some feedback to say, hey, we like the lectures, but we'd really like to be able to listen to them more as a podcast on the way to work. That way, you don't actually have to get stuck looking at my face for 30 minutes. You can just put the audio on and go. Alternatively, it's also a different way of accommodating some learning styles that might be more audio-centric. So for this lecture, just sit back, listen. You don't have to follow along with the PowerPoint. But what I want to do this week is really talk about the government and nonprofit relationship. Now, I know that the first half of T&B Chapter 14 really emphasized more of the public relations piece and some ways to communicate strategically, but the chapter did move in towards the end in discussing how nonprofit and government agencies interact. And what I've seen so far in the discussion posts is that most of the comments are oriented around the PR section. Presumably because that's something that's more in everybody's wheelhouse. That's something that you guys have experience with in the nonprofit sector. If you don't have experience working in the sector, then it's certainly something that's more familiar to you just as a term. Even outside of nonprofits, people are pretty familiar with the term public relations. But what I did see was some people going, I'm not sure that I want to address this intersectoral relationship because I don't have a lot of experience with it. And I might be making some implications or assumptions out of those types of comments, but what that says to me as an instructor is that there's an opportunity here to explain why it matters. Why do we need to understand the nature of these relationships? Specifically, if you're working in about 1 out of every 2 nonprofits that does not collaborate directly with a state or federal agency, how does this fit into the work that you're doing? And in order to make this picture clearer, we need to start looking at this 10,000-foot view. We can't necessarily be hung up in the day-to-day tasks of managing, but we need to have a feel for the sector as a whole. And so that's where something like this lecture hopefully will come into play. So first, let's go through, and I want to just give you guys a little bit of context or history around the movement towards nonprofits interacting with government agencies. Hopefully some of this will be a refresher from what we've covered earlier in the semester for you as well. So when we're talking about the nonprofit sector and really where it really started kind of forming in the way that we recognize it today, we're taking ourselves back to the 19-teens. And it was in 1913 in Ohio that community chests originated. And these were local community-driven efforts to fundraise. So nonprofit professionals would come together on these associations. They would identify potential donor pools. They would get those resources together and distribute them back to the communities. Community chests were in a lot of ways the precursor to what we call the United Way today. There's one of your connecting points. But this model really endured until about the 1930s. And then all of a sudden we saw a shift in the federal landscape. I'm bringing you back to history course. This is when FDR came in with the New Deal. And the biggest implication of the New Deal and of FDR's tenure as president really was the expansion of federal government. What should government be responsible for doing for its people? And one of the key ideological cornerstones of his administration was the idea that government was responsible for providing services to its constituents. So this took on what we call the modern day welfare state. And not welfare necessarily in the sense of SNAP or TANF, but in a broader sense of social welfare. All of a sudden, it became the purview of government, federal government in particular, to provide the scope of services. But despite efforts to expand the federal government's role, particularly through an accumulation of funding, the administration also recognized that there were limits on what federal agencies in particular were equipped to do. So they reached out to nonprofit organizations and really started funding these groups in earnest. And so what we see is a shift in the landscape from relying primarily on private charitable donations and an increased reliance on federal funding in particular, a little bit of state funding, but mostly federal funding for sustainability. Now, this model is going to continue In part, it's promulgated by the war efforts. We need these services at a local level. It continues through the roaring 50s when we're on this economic boom. And then boom, we hit the 1960s. Well, it's here really that scholars, Lester Salomon in particular, identifies what he calls a series of legitimacy crises that the nonprofit sector faced. And in a nutshell, what these crises really boil down to is a sense of fiscal responsibility and scope. So it was, what are we doing as a sector? What services are we providing? How can we be justified by not turning a profit or not being competitive in the same way that corporate enterprise is? And scholars in the 1960s recognized that if something didn't change, the sector would presumably go extinct. There wasn't a place for the nonprofit sector in the way that it had been established over the past 50 years. But because there was still federal funding available, this meant that increasingly nonprofit organizations started collaborating directly with government. So with a pool of donors who were helping provide their revenue bases. It's a complicated relationship, though, right? On the one hand, the federal government is saying, hey, we want to continue providing you these resources, but we need a sense of accountability. We need to know where our dollars are going. So nonprofit organizations say, you know what, come on in, come be a partner. We will collaborate with you. This is the beginning of what we call the network mode of service delivery. Sometimes we call it governance or new public management. But the idea was that government and nonprofits were really working hand in hand to deliver these services. Government wanted the oversight, nonprofits needed the funding. Now, why is this relationship complex? It comes down to the idea of inviting a partner who is also holding onto your financial leash. It's a bit like having a boss who's also your friend. It's okay to go out and grab a beer with her on a Friday night, but at the end of the day, she also controls your salary. So even though on some level you have this level of equity between you, this level of equalness in your relationship, there's still an inherent understanding that there is a hierarchy. At the end of the day, she's still responsible for whether or not you will continue to have employment in that organization. The government-nonprofit relationship was not entirely different from that, and yet it was a model that continued, at least for a while. Let's jump to the 1980s. In the United States, that was Reaganism. Globally, we call this Thatcherism. And the key ideological underpinning of this type of movement was small government. In order to stimulate economic growth, we need government to stop being a suck on the taxpayers' money. It's not the most eloquent way to say it, but that was the gist in a nutshell. And so what that meant for nonprofits was that all of a sudden they had to get innovative, because for the past 50 years, from the 1930s in particular through the 1980s, the nonprofit sector as a whole had grown really accustomed to depending on federal and state funding for their survival. This is where we see, we're going to tie it back into some of the earlier readings, the movement towards the entrepreneurial spirit of nonprofit organizations. They had to become innovative. They had to look for sources outside of government to supply some revenue streams. That's where they started getting more invested in corporate philanthropy, getting donations from major corporations, increasing individual donor retention across the populace. So there were a lot of different exercises going on to help keep the nonprofit sector viable, despite the shift in landscape that said the federal government went, hey, even if we kind of like your program, hands are tied, we don't have the money to do this. All right, so where does that put us today? This is why it matters. We have a legacy of kind of ups and downs in the sector on where our funding sources come from. So even though the language in T&B, or even in that Gasly article referring to the scope of contracts or the nature of government contracts, and you go, well, hold on, wait a minute, I don't really get how this makes sense. Why is this relevant? Well, let's look at it through the tangible aspect of funding. What happens now? We're in an administrative cycle, and I do my best to not be political in this class, but that could be really damning for nonprofit organizations. If these proposed budget cuts go through, they're going to nix a lot of our big circuit nonprofit organizations, or at least do severe damage that will restrict their the number of programs that they'll be able to provide. And then you might go, well, hold on, wait a minute. But you also taught us that these large-scale organizations only constitute a small percent of the roughly 1.5 million organizations that are registered under the nonprofit code in the United States. So how does this affect me if I'm not working for a major nonprofit like NPR or the National Endowment for the Humanities? Well, let's take an example of if you work for a local health clinic in Wichita. And all of a sudden, the Planned Parenthood that's in a neighboring town is forced to close its doors because their Medicaid expenditures are on freeze. They're not going to be reimbursed. They have to turn clients away. Where do those clients go? To your local health clinic. Are you getting more funding to help serve those clients? Probably not. At least not immediately. What do you do? What happens now when some seemingly innocuous federal or state policy that was not presumed to have a direct impact on your organization all of a sudden does because of indirect impacts? What do we have to do as a sector to keep organizations providing the same level of quality of service, the same scope of programs in the face of these types of cutbacks? So let's say that there are still some opportunities for funding. How do we start thinking about how we interact with government to get that funding? How do we make grants proposals competitive? How do we structure the language of our proposal requests? How do we justify that our nonprofit is in a niche or providing a service that would be detrimental to the community if we alone didn't provide it? These are the types of considerations that nonprofit organizations are facing now. And that's what is the tie-in from nonprofit and government relationships. And what we saw in the 1980s was that the nonprofit sector, despite federal cuts, became incredibly resilient, became innovative, became entrepreneurial. Do we think now that we're in a time where we're going to have to go through that as a sector again? What does that look like? We've talked in some of our threaded discussions about new advents for affordable ways to market, for instance, through social media, which might be good or ill depending on your perspective or how they're used. If we're faced with stiffer budget allocations, what happens when we start thinking about things like the overhead myth? Well, we want to keep our programs, so we need to lower our administrative costs. Maybe we lay off some staff. Maybe we restructure some departments. Maybe we don't upgrade to technology. Well, that keeps our programs going, but it doesn't keep the quality of the programs intact. So there are lots of different considerations that are on the table here. How do we innovate now as a sector? How do we navigate relationships with these government agencies that may or may not be around to provide funding? One solution for innovation might be to increase the partnerships with private organizations. And that's something that we'll get into more next week. But to be thinking about it, we could say, for instance, a lot of the work that I do with another instructor at the School of Public Affairs, her name is Danielle Varda. She's really big into social network analysis. And it might be a jargony term, maybe you're familiar with it, but in a nutshell, network analysis is just a methodological tool that says the relationships between people and the relationships across organizations matter. And if we can empirically understand the nature of those relationships, we can improve efficiency and we can improve the quality of employee satisfaction and of service delivery. And so a lot of what we see when we do this empirical work is that, let's take a small town in Colorado. And the school district in that town notices that too many of its students in high school are using tobacco products. And the school says, all right, well, we want to come up with a program to reduce tobacco dependency in our youth. How do we do that? Well, the school might have some experts in place. They might also reach out to parents or community advocates. They might also get some dollars from philanthropic corporate giving with companies that are invested. And this is a long-range goal because it'll better serve them down the line. And they're also probably going to team up with local nonprofits. They might team up with that local health clinic. Because even though tobacco dependency might not be a central focal point of that health clinic's mission, it's not entirely outside of the purview either. They have a vested interest in making sure that this initiative goes forward. And so we're seeing more and more of these types of community-driven grassroots partnerships, coming up to overcome these deficits. And a growing player in this movement is actually the corporate industry. And that's why I wanted to introduce it, because we're going to be moving there next week. So this is a brand new format for me. I haven't ever gone in and given a lecture kind of straight through like this. But hopefully in the brief 20 minutes or so that this was going on, you were able to get a sense of where the idea behind nonprofit and government partnerships really emerged, how it developed over time, where we're at now, and some of the considerations that nonprofit organizations are going to have to make in order to keep the sector relevant moving forward. So even though these types of interactions may not be something that impact your organizations individually, start thinking about the ways that different administrative policies at the federal level, the advent of something like social media, this new call for innovation, how these things might actually kind of trickle down and have impacts on your organization, and how we go about really clearly articulating our mission, our justification, why our niche is important, why we can serve this community better than other organizations. It sounds competitive. To some degree it is. And we also, on the flip side of that coin, need to understand the cooperation element. How do we communicate? Where do we go for resources? What do we do in times of fiscal crisis, like we saw in the Hu and Capuccio article a couple of weeks back? These are the types of questions to be thinking about. So again, I hope that this lecture could help kind of provide some sense of why are we studying this? Why do we care? But again, as always, if you have questions about it, if something's still not making sense, or if you have comments that you're just like dying to get out, please always feel free to email, post them in your groups, post them on the general questions discussion hub, and just go through with this kind of open mind of the 10,000 foot view, so that we continue and expand the scope next week to incorporate private organizations as well. And just as a quick reminder, if you have not seen the Canvas announcement, I did give an extension on first draft. So instead of being due this Sunday, because it is the Easter holiday, and I suspect that at least some of you observe that holiday, please feel free to turn in your first draft by Tuesday. So anyhow, have a great evening. Have a wonderful weekend. I look forward to jumping in and seeing how this organic discussion format is unfolding. And we'll be talking soon. Have a good night.